Welcome to page 83 of Anatomy Coloring Book. This is Dr. Stephen Harkins. In this lesson, we will learn about the cranial nerves. Cranium means head, so these are the nerves that come out of the head or out of the spinal cord within the skull, and they innervate and they supply the skin, muscles, glands, organs of the head and face mostly. But they're cranial nerves because of where they exit, where they come from. They don't come from the spine. These are not neurons that travel from the brain down to the spinal cord and out to your arms and legs or down and exit through your spine. They exit above the level of the spine. They exit within your skull. These nerves do. There is one nerve, the vagus nerve, that exits. It begins in the skull. It exits in the skull and then travels all the way down and does innervate organs and glands and structures below the head and neck. But the idea of a cranial nerve is that the nerves, like right here, they exit from areas of the brain stem, the pons, the medulla, the midbrain. Anyway, they exit this area of the spinal above the spinal cord. So these are not nerves that exit from the spinal cord. They're nerves that exit above the spinal cord. There are, in fact, 12 of these cranial nerves. They are often identified with Roman numerals 1, 2, 3, etc. 1, 2, 3, 4. Students often make up mnemonic devices to memorize. They use the first letter, memorize the 12 cranial nerves. They'll use the first letter O, 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 T, T, A, F, V, G, V, A, H, and they'll make up a clever story or sentence using those letters, and I advise you to do the same. Let's start with cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve. The olfactory nerve, here's cranial nerve number 1. Olfactory has to do with the sense of smell. And so you can see this little nerve right here. There are olfactory receptors on the roof of the palate here. As you breathe in, particles and chemicals come in and they brush the top of your palate there. And there are receptors there that travel through the olfactory nerve, the olfactory cranial nerve, to the brain so that your brain can make sense and interpret that sensation. And here is the olfactory bulb, as it's called. That would be on top of the palate here. And when those smells come in, the messages are sent through this nerve to areas of the brain stem to interpret. There's an olfactory bulb on the left side there, and one on the right. And these are your receptors in this area here, your smell receptors. So that's the olfactory nerve, the sense of smell. Cranial nerve number 1. Cranial nerve number 2 is known as the optic nerve. You might guess optic nerve has to do with vision, and you would be absolutely correct. So this is cranial nerve number 2. The optic nerve, it's right over here. Cranial nerve number 2. And the retina contains the sensory receptors for vision. So light will come in through the pupil and it will hit the cells of the retina, the receptors of the retina. That will send a signal back through cranial nerve number 2 called the optic nerve. And here it is down here. Right through here, through the optic chiasm. And back into areas of the brainstem and brain. That's cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve. Cranial nerve number 3 is known as the oculomotor nerve. And just like it sounds, it is having to do with the eye, but not the vision, but the motor portion of the eye. In other words, the muscles of the eye. The oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve number 3. Let's take a look at it. Here is the eye. Here are the muscles of cranial nerve number 3 innervates and controls. It's interesting because, look, a couple of the muscles are not innervated by the cranial nerve number 3. They're innervated by number 4. But the oculomotor nerve over here, it innervates all of the muscles except the lateral rectus muscle. That's this muscle here, except this one, and the superior oblique, which is this muscle up here. It does not innervate these, but it innervates all the others. But another thing that it does is it innervates these muscles for movement, for eye movement, right? And these muscles here for eye movement. But it also innervates your pupillary reflex, your pupillary sphincter muscles, the muscles that widen, that open your eyes wider, and then shut them or close them, the pupil. You've seen your own pupils wide, dilated, and constricted. And that is a parasympathetic activity. Actually, it's a action you can't control by yourself. It happens automatically. And so the dilation and constriction of the eye. So the control of eye muscles, cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor nerve, control of eye muscles, plus the dilation and constriction of your pupils. That's the pupillary sphincter. So it's a motor nerve because it travels to the, and tells these muscles to contract. But it is also a parasympathetic nerve, a visceral efferent nerve, in that it controls the constriction and dilation of the pupil. Now, the trochlear nerve we alluded to, it is cranial nerve number 4, trochlear nerve. Trochlear nerve simply controls, as we said, these two muscles of the eye. The superior oblique muscle goes underneath, and the lateral rectus muscle, moving your eye from side to side. So very simple. It is a motor nerve. It is an efferent with efferent fibers that signal to your eye to move in certain directions. The trochlear nerve number 4, cranial nerve number 4. And it looks as though I've made an error. It is cranial nerve number 6 that controls the lateral rectus. So Trochlear nerve simply controls one muscle, the superior oblique muscle of the eye. This one only. And here you can see the trochlear nerve exiting the brainstem. And while we're at it, let's review. Here is the oculomotor nerve exiting the brainstem and heading towards the eye. Trochlear number 4, oculomotor number 3. The fifth cranial nerve is known as the trigeminal nerve. Very, very important nerve of the head and face. Here it is over here, the trigeminal nerve. It is both afferent and efferent in that it controls the muscles of chewing, the muscles of mastication. This is the temporalis muscle, the masseter muscle. And it also is responsible for the feeling that you have in your face. So if you were to touch your face anywhere in this area from these 3 branches, that's why it's called the trigeminal nerve, because it has these 3 facial branches here, here, and here. So the sensation you have, the feeling on your face, comes from receptors at the end of the trigeminal nerve, the 5th cranial nerve. And here you can see the 5th cranial nerve. The signals will come from your face over here and travel into this nerve and into the brainstem, the pons area of the brainstem. So for those 3 branches, branch number 1, 2, and 3. And also you can see an area for efferent in the trigeminal nerve, an area where nerves would come out. Of course, they would come and these motor nerves, and they would innervate the muscles that you chew your food with. That's the trigeminal nerve, the 5th cranial nerve. Furthermore, also along with the muscles of mastication, the tensor tympani muscle. This is the muscle, the tiny, tiny, tiny little muscle that tenses your eardrum. And there's a, believe it or not, there's a tiny muscle, attached to your eardrum to make it nice and tight. The tensor veli palatini, which is a palate muscle inside your palate, inside your the roof of your mouth. And some other, the mylohyoid and digastric muscles, which are some of the muscles controlling the movement of your jaw and the movement of their palate underneath your throat, underneath your jaw. The abducens nerve, cranial nerve number 6. And it's a very simple nerve, much like the trochlear nerve, number 4. Cranial nerve number 6, very, very simple in that it only has one function. And this is where I made the error earlier. It is the 6th cranial nerve that controls one single muscle, the lateral rectus muscle. Here. Let's erase this part real quick. There you go. So you can see the abducens cranial nerve controls one thing and one thing only, the lateral rectus muscle. The trochlear nerve, similarly, does one thing only, the superior oblique. Now the facial nerve, another large and important nerve of the, we're going to switch back to red on a cranial nerve. And it has a lot of responsibility right here, the facial nerve. And let's back up for 1 second and trace the abducens nerve, cranial nerve number 6, coming out of the pons medulla area of the brainstem. Cranial nerve number 6 going outward. It's an efferent muscle to efferent nerve to the lateral rectus. And here we are at the facial nerve again. Facial nerve is cranial nerve number 7. Innervating, its motor function is to innervate the muscles of facial expression. Anytime you squint or smile or make any sort of expression with your face, it is controlled by the cranial nerve number 7. So in contrast to cranial nerve number 5, which controlled cranial nerve number 5, which controlled the muscles of facial muscles of chewing, mastication, the facial muscles of expression are controlled by cranial nerve number 7. Now, nerve number 7 also innervates taste. So it's not only is it motor and efferent, controlling the muscles of expression, it is also afferent, controls the taste receptors. The receptors of taste on the front of the tongue, the anterior portion of the tongue, not the back of the tongue, the front of the tongue. The back happens to be a different cranial nerve. So the taste receptors of the tongue. So that's an afferent activity, an afferent. So there are afferent nerves going to the brain, giving it sensation. And then there are muscles. You can imagine tasting something awful. The sensation going in to the cranial nerve number 7, through cranial nerve number 7 to the brain stem, and then you making an expression of disgust with your facial muscles. That would be all activities of the traveling through the facial nerve. And lastly, the salivary glands, such as the submandibular gland and the sublingual salivary glands, and the lacrimal gland, the gland of tearing, the gland that would cause you to cry, are also controlled by, are innervated by the facial nerve. You can imagine tasting something disgusting, making an expression, and crying, or something hot, spicy. Those all activities would be occurring through the facial nerve. And here we see the facial nerve coming into the medulla oblongata, between the pons and the medulla oblongata there. So, and you see the arrows saying, yes, we're afferent, we have coming in, and we also have information coming out, because as we discussed, it has both motor and sensory properties. The vestibulocochlear nerve is cranial nerve number 8. Cranial nerve number 8. And just as its name suggests, it does two things. It innervates, and it is an afferent nerve, meaning it only brings information into the brain. It is not a motor nerve. It doesn't control any muscles. And here it is, cranial nerve number 8. There are two sections of the inner ear, and there is the cochlear section and the vestibular. These vestibules, these looping structures. The cochlear part is for hearing. Is for bringing the sensation of hearing. Anything you hear, any noise that comes in through the ear canal, vibrates off of the tympanic membrane and is received, and there are receptors in this cochlea that carry signals, auditory signals, back to your brain. Now, part 2 is this branch here, the vestibular branch. The vestibular branch here has to do with your balance. Your inner ear not only hears, but is responsible for hearing, but also for balance. You can see the separation here between the cochlear and then the vestibular. Each one of these rings is responsible for balance and for equilibrium in different directions. And they're orientated upright, sideways, and in different planes. The longitudinal, frontal, and sagittal, transverse, and frontal planes, to respond to head movements for your equilibrium and balance. And again, the signals are carried to the brain through the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 8. And here is the information going into the vestibulocochlear nerve and into the medulla oblongata for processing, and then obviously a signal will be sent up to the brain, to the cerebrum, so we can interpret what we just heard, etc. Cranial nerve number 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. And it too is very descriptive in what it does. The glosso means tongue, and pharyngeal means the pharynx, or the back of the mouth, the palate. Cranial nerve number 9. And here it is, cranial nerve number 9, a description of its functions. So first, the glosso, the tongue. It controls not the muscle of the tongue, but the sensation, the taste in the back of the tongue. Recall that it was the facial nerve here that is in charge of messages from the front of the tongue, the anterior portion of the trunk. Glossopharyngeal has to do with the back of the tongue, taste from the back of the tongue. And the pharyngeal, it also controls some of these muscles over here, of the or the sensation from the mucous membranes of the back of the mouth, the pharynx, the auditory tube, and the middle ear. That's the skin and the membranes surrounding some of these areas around here. So sensation from a lot of this area from the back of the throat. If you had a sore throat, I imagine the signals of pain would be traveling through the glossopharyngeal nerve. And it also innervates the parotid gland, this gland right here, parasympathetic stimulation of the parotid gland. Parotid gland is a gland on the side of your face that also creates saliva and fluid for your mouth and nasal and palate area. And some of the muscles on the back of the throat as well. So posterior 1/3 of the tongue, some muscles and sensation from the back of the pharynx and the parotid gland. That's the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve number 9. Cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus nerve, extremely important nerve. Number 10, X. Vagus nerve does have something something to do with the taste receptors at the base of the tongue and the epiglottis, so way deep back in your throat. And some muscular control there too, or some sensation from back there as well. But mostly the most important function of the vagus nerve is that it is the parasympathetic or autonomic nervous system signal. It carries signals all the way down. It exits the cranium and heads down, or exits your skull and goes down, 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 and innervates the abdominal viscera, the muscles of the thoracic and abdominal viscera. So that means your heart, that means your lungs, that means your gut. And here we have cranial nerve number 10 right here, and you can see exactly that. The cranial nerve number 10 is responsible for all of this parasympathetic activity. For example, when your body needs to slow down and relax, signal will be sent to your parasympathetic, from your parasympathetic nervous system through the vagus nerve, and it'll tell your heart or your lungs to, breathe more slowly when it's time, and then it'll tell your heart to beat more slowly, and it'll tell your gut it's time to rest and relax, right? It's time to digest your food. It'll tell your gut to speed up. So it's sending all these signals down to your muscle, or to your organs and glands to work, to go to work, or to relax, or to increase or decrease their activity. The vagus nerve also carries signals to the brain from the heart and from the lungs and from the gut. Now, if you have a pain in your gut, or you get punched in the gut, or pain in your heart or lungs, or you're a punctured lung or something like that, those signals will be sent to the nervous system, and signals as to when the body needs to know what's going on with your heart and lungs and organs. That signal will be sent to the brain or through the vagus nerve. And here we can see signals coming into the vagus nerve here and leaving the vagus nerve, as it is both afferent and efferent properties. Now, this nerve will loop down and go through the skull and down, down to through the neck and into the chest and abdominal cavities. Cranial nerve number 11 is the accessory nerve, also known as the spinal accessory nerve. The spinal accessory nerve is unique because of its path of travel. So it actually comes up from the neck area, and it takes branches from the neck, spinal nerves, and then it travels up and gathers a little bit of information here from the brainstem, and then loops around and heads back down through a hole in the skull to innervate over here the sternocleidomastoid mastoid muscle, the neck muscle, and the trapezius muscles. This is the spinal accessory nerve, cranial nerve number 11. And it is strictly a motor nerve controlling the contraction of those muscles. So since it travels up and then exits again through this, what's called the jugular foramen, this hole in the skull, along with the jugular vein, since it travels through the skull, it is considered a cranial nerve. And lastly, the hypoglossal nerve. I mentioned before that gloss means tongue. And this is cranial nerve number 12. And here you can see cranial nerve number 12 and the muscles of the tongue. So it was the facial nerve, cranial nerve number 7, and the the glossopharyngeal nerve that controlled taste of the tongue. Remember the front and the back of the tongue. What is the hypoglossal nerve that is strictly an efferent nerve for the muscles of the tongue. Every time you chew food and move it around in your mouth, those messages from your tongue that your tongue receives to chew and how to chew and where to move the food comes from the brainstem through the medulla oblongata, through the hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve number 12. And this concludes our review of the cranial nerves. I'm Dr. Stephen Harkins. Until next time.